Although obviously there's a lot of amazing things in the gospel lesson that we just heard, in that it's a healing story, one of the most amazing things, at least to me, is that it occurred at all. And I don't just mean the healing part. I mean that this man, Bartimaeus, was ever even known to Jesus. The reason I say this is because in this portion of Mark's gospel, Jesus is steps away from his triumphant entry into Jerusalem. He's headed towards that event, that week, that last week of his life where he's going to enter into the city and find their betrayal, his passion, his death, the right at hand. And this is very much on his mind, these important things that are in front of him. And so in Mark's gospel, the healing ministry of Jesus really has shut down completely into this event. Furthermore, this man Bartimaeus is just some guy in a crowd. He's surrounded by people. He's lost in the crowd, as we say. And there are people, as we hear, who are actively trying to silence him. In essence, what they're saying to him is Jesus is just too busy for you. And really, Jesus is rather busy. But more than that, it's just hard to overcome a crowd. It's hard to get noticed in a crowd, particularly when you're someone people try not to see, like so oftentimes happens with the disabled. When Shelley and I were in Kansas City while I was going to seminary, both of us had a job working with adults with developmental disabilities. And my job was to take them out into the city so that they would experience their community, and their community would get an experience of them. And yet what I noticed in this, and what sticks with me, is the discomfort so many people had towards the people that I was working with. How they would move away and avoid and wouldn't look at. They felt uncomfortable if anything wasn't completely right, which is, oftentimes just how it is. This discomfort that they had to live with not being seen. And this blind beggar somehow, nonetheless, gets seen. In fact, he demands that he be seen. He demands that he be heard. He's not going to be tucked away. And I guess what's behind that is just hope. And yet, whatever it is, it causes him to cry out to Jesus. And Jesus hears him despite the roar of the crowd. Jesus stops despite the very important things that he has to do. And Jesus tells his disciples to call the man forward, even though moments before he was just a face in a crowd. Jesus reminds me here of what they said of St. Francis of Assisi. They described St. Francis as a man who refused to see the forest for the love of the trees. Jesus doesn't look, in other words, at a crowd and see a crowd. He sees people, which was the point of his coming to these crowds in the first place. People, persons, you and me. Now, Mark tells us two things in this healing story that he does not say in any other. He tells us the healed man's name, Bartimaeus, and he tells us that Bartimaeus follows Jesus from that day on. So very much more than just this being a healing story to show off Jesus' power, at heart, this is a story about discipleship. It's a story about a man who was healed enough to follow Jesus. And really, isn't that what is happening with all of us? That it's out of our woundedness and the things that aren't right within us that God speaks and somehow gives us the courage out of that woundedness to follow behind. It's usually what causes us to know that we need to follow behind, because we know what it's like to follow the wrong things. We know what it's like to have that woundedness. But this is different in the healing stories. I guess that's because a lot of people, they come to Jesus. They still, by the way, do still come to Jesus with kind of their own agenda. They need something. They want something. That part of the story really is not that unusual. Lots of folks want to be healed. Most of us here would love it if Jesus would solve difficult problems, fix what's wrong with us and the world, and then just kind of let us go on our way. Thank you very much. But not everyone is willing to follow. Not everyone is willing really to be known. And yet Bartimaeus is interested in both. And what's interesting about that is that Jesus actually tells Bartimaeus that he's free to go on his own way. He is free to go and do his own thing. And think of all that Bartimaeus would want to see and do and experience, having been blind and all. And yet he doesn't. Bartimaeus instead follows Jesus from that day on. And because he does, we know him. And he serves really as a model, at least in my mind, of what discipleship looks like. So Bartimaeus is as much a hero in this story as just some guy who got healed. He's a hero to anyone who finds it hard to step out, but somehow yet finds the courage to do so in faith. He's a hero to all who refuse to let a crowd determine who they are, and boy, do we need that more in this world right now. He's a hero to anyone who is desperate for something beyond themselves, and to all who are willing to risk everything to get it. Bartimaeus is a hero to all who dare to act. And he dares to act right from the start. I mean, did you notice how Jesus tells Bartimaeus to come to him? Now why is that? It's easier for Jesus to go to Bartimaeus. After all, he can see. But Jesus calls Bartimaeus to take this initiative and to act. And again, for Bartimaeus, stepping out is hard. The crowds are against him. One of the reasons they're against him, by the way, is this terrible, bad folk theology that blamed the victim. Would say, well, God made the world good, and here's this man that's blind, so who did something wrong? And we think, oh, I can't believe those primitive people would think like that. And yet we do it all the time. Blame the poor or the dispossessed. It's easy to blame the victim and to shut them down. And yet, even though the world was against this man, he would not be put off. In fact, he throws off his cloak, we're told, when Jesus says to come. Now think about this. This is, in essence, his coat. There's no safety net, social safety net here. This man is a blind beggar living in the streets. That cloak is about all he's got. It's what he has for security and warmth, but he abandons it reflexively for the shot at something more. And thus, at least to me, Bartimaeus becomes a hero, because Bartimaeus dared to act. C.S. Lewis, in his book Screw Tape Letters, gives this interesting correspondence between two devils. There's a senior devil writing an apprentice devil, and he's trying to give him advice on how to keep this new convert to Christianity from going too deep in his Christian faith, and how to try to maneuver him away from his faith. And so the devil's answer is to prevent the convert from ever doing anything with his faith. He writes this: the great thing is to prevent his doing anything. As long as he does not convert his faith into action, it does not matter how much he thinks about it. Let the little brute wallow in it. Let him do anything but act. No amount of piety in his imagination and affections will harm us if we can keep it out of his will. The more that he feels without acting, the less he will ever be able to act. And in the long run, the less he will ever be able to feel. How does the devil keep you from going deep with God? Convinces you not to do anything. Don't act. Don't do. Don't risk. I see this in little ways played out all the time, in my own life, certainly in the church's life. I know if, for instance, somebody is fairly new to the church throughout my ministry, if they get involved, but they start coming, but they never really get involved in doing some ministry of some sort, history kind of tells me that they probably won't be with us for very long. They can love the sermons, but that's going to be short-lived in memory. They can love the music, but then they're going to ruin it by the pop radio they listen to on the way home. They can love the warm feelings that they feel, and yet the busyness of life is going to allow for petty distractions to drown all of that every time. It is only in acting upon one's faith, in following Jesus actively, that the difference is ever really made. That nascent healing that God's doing in all of us becomes the all-encompassing reality of life. Because that's the only way to not just be made well, but to truly be healed. See, Christianity is really about active engagement and doing. It's about following. It's about doing. It's about being, not just thinking a certain way about certain topics. Jesus is not looking, by the way, for people who just agree with him. He certainly could care less about somebody admiring him. What Jesus makes very, very clear is that he is looking for people who are willing to follow him. And this world needs people to follow the way of Jesus. And Bartimaeus, well, he was just such a person. And what's weird, even though he was blind, he had some sort of vision. Helen Keller, in fact, said, most people have sight. That's no big deal. But few people have vision. Bartimaeus saw enough to see that there are some things worth being desperate for. So desperate that it turns into action. And he had this desperate seeing faith in a distracting, blinding world, and that made all the difference. I don't know if you know this about me. I am a worrier. I am exceptionally good at it. Especially like 3 o'clock in the morning, I'm great. I'm really one of those people. I worry if there's not something to worry about. I worry I'm missing something. And that's because I like things steady and stable and secure and known. And yet, when I think about where Jesus has led me and my family as a priest, my love for security makes my vocation very bizarre to me. Right at the gate, the bishop asked me to start a new congregation. I felt led to go help turn around one that was about to die. Moved to a place I'd never, known anything much about in Roanoke, Virginia. How does that happen to somebody who worries all the time? It's Jesus. And my worries, I don't know about you, but I can get lost. Worry and fear can easily launch an assault against hope. Worry and fear can so easily lead to inaction. And yet, somehow, a little bit, I guess, I've learned, or I'm learning, that I can make out really the only important things amongst the clutter of worrisome stuff only when I concentrate on what really matters. And what really matters in my life is Jesus. And so when I focus a little bit on him, I find a little bit of clarity, just enough vision to gain the truest sight into who I really am and what I really am to do. It's really only in him that at least I find the courage to act. Without him, I'm just some guy in a crowd, lost in the crowd, crowded out by concerns and anxieties and busyness. They can crowd out everything if I'm not careful. In fact, they can even crowd out me. And yet, and here's the great thing, Jesus still sees me in that crowd. And he sees you in that crowd because Jesus can't see the forest for the love of the trees. He never sees a crowd. He always sees the person, the potential, you and me. And you know what? Any day of the week, I will follow that. The question is, will you? I hope you will. Amen.